Welcome, everyone, to the 2022 Ruth Ratner Miller Memorial Award for Excellence in American History. And this year's honored recipient is Sean Wilentz, but I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit because my job is to introduce Maya Jasanoff, who is going to introduce Sean Wilentz. But first, I'll tell you that I am Stephan Bader. I am the treasurer of the Friends of the Concord Free Public Library. And the Friends of the Library are the sponsors, the managers of the festival, the festival and the Miller Award. And we have been doing that for over 20 years now. Tonight is... I want to thank several people. I want to thank the Miller Memorial Award Committee, which has 9. I'm not doing math well on the fly tonight. 9 people, as you can see on the back of your program. Your program tells you a little bit about the Friends, the award, and the sequence of events. Through the miracle of modern technology, we have Maya Jasanoff to introduce Professor Wilentz, but she's not in the room. She's on Zoom. And so when Caroline gets us queued up, I am going to introduce her, and she will proceed with the program after that. Oh, there she goes. I should tell you that Maya Jasanoff is the Coolidge Professor of History at Harvard University. She's been a Guggenheim Fellow, a Fellow at the New York Public Library's Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, a Klug Chair at the Library of Congress, a member of the Institute for Advanced Study and Chair of Judges for the 2021 Booker Prize. And I'm told that she and Sean were working at the New York Public Library together. That's where you met each other. And we are honored to have her with us tonight virtually. And I wish you enjoyment of the program and the following festivities. Thank you.
Good evening. The award that we're gathered here to celebrate tonight recognizes Ruth Ratner Miller, who believed that learning history was not merely desirable, but a civic and religious duty. In this year's recipient of the Ruth Ratner Miller Award, Sean Wilentz, the George Henry Davis 1886 Professor of American History at Princeton University, you have a scholar whose work on American civic and religious life has made him a landmark contributor to our understanding of what history can achieve. Wilentz is quite simply one of the most versatile historians of the United States working today. His writing ranges from the early 19th century to the early 21st. He's written books on Andrew Jackson and Bob Dylan, on Chance Democratic, the title of his first book about the rise of the New York working class, and 360 Sound, the title of a recent book chronicling the history of Columbia Records. What's more, you'll find Sean Wilentz's writings spread across every major newspaper and magazine. Just last week, I enjoyed his sparkling review of Maggie Haberman's book about Trump in the Washington Post. You're as likely to find his writing in the pages of the New Republic, once described as the in-flight magazine of Air Force One, of which he was for a long time a contributing editor, as you are to find his writing in Rolling Stone, for which he wrote a sensational 2006 cover story entitled George W. Bush, the Worst President in History? A question which, incidentally, Sean came to answer again with something else in a piece about Trump in the New York Times not so long ago. Sean Wilentz is a public intellectual in the mold of Richard Hofstadter, whose works he's editing for the Library of America, by conveying in nuance, in insisting on nuance in accessible prose, and also in the model of Arthur Schlesinger Jr., to whom he's often been compared and who was a previous recipient of this award, in serving as a counselor to presidents from Bill Clinton to Joe Biden. But we're very lucky to have Sean writing in and of our times, which needs a historian of his talents more than most. Wilentz describes himself as a historian of US politics and society. But his work is more than the history of politics. It's really an argument for the centrality of politics in historical change and for approaching the workings of politics in molecular terms. His landmark and prize-winning book, The Rise of American Democracy, tracks the development of political life through the contingent struggles of class interests and of undeniably outsized historical figures from Jackson to Lincoln. He's a fluent authority on the dynamics of party politics, and he traces the history of partisanship to argue that we actually need parties and politics in order to achieve the closest things that we can get to egalitarian measures. One of the many things that I admire about Sean is how he writes about political life of recent times, with a willingness to take seriously some of the figures who are often, I think, condescended to by those on the left, or treated just as kind of stereotypical bogeymen, people like Ronald Reagan, for one. And he does it without condescension and with a real sense of insight about their contributions to the country that we inhabit. I can think of no better corpus for understanding the now much discussed rise of populism than Sean's work. And he's now engaged in what promises to be an indispensable treatment of politics, slavery, and race in the United States, a counterpart to his volume on the rise of American democracy, which is about the political history of American anti-slavery, the subject of his lecture tonight. Spending time with Sean, as I was privileged to do ever since we were fellows together at the New York Public Library more than 15 years ago, means getting to interact with a wonderfully insightful, entertaining, funny, and worldly companion. I'm grateful to have had many chances to enjoy Sean's company along with his work, just as you will tonight. And I wish you a wonderful evening in honoring his many contributions to American history. With that, and no further ado, it's my great honor to introduce Professor Sean Wilentz.
Wow, thank you. She's not there anymore. She's no cable connected. Okay. Wow, it's a really special honor to be in this extraordinary building. I've never set foot in here until this afternoon. You are a very, very fortunate bunch to have in this institution like this, about which I'll be saying a little bit more. But Caroline and I both were just overwhelmed. We were sitting in the felicitously named Transcendental Cove, which I highly recommend for its surroundings, for its knowledge, and for its quiet, and for its transcendence. So thank you all, and thanks to Anne. Thank you so much for everything in making this possible. Thanks to the committee. Thank you so much for selecting me. This really is an honor. I am greatly moved to be honored with this year's Ruth Ratner Miller Award, and for several reasons. To receive such a distinction from the friends of so excellent and venerable an institution as the College Street Public Library is very special. All the more so as the award celebrates the memory of an admirable a civic leader as Ruth Ratner Miller, a champion of the study and teaching of American history. On those accounts alone, I accept your award with great pride. But there's more. Looking at the list of previous recipients of this award is truly humbling, including, as it does, so many of the finest historians this country has ever produced. To be added to that list is as close as I can imagine to being elected to a kind of Hall of Fame. I was kind of wondering where Willie Mays was on the list, but never mind. Of course, I could not help but notice that the list strongly represents scholars with a distinction that I cannot claim. That is a formal institutional connection to a certain great university located in Cambridge. And I don't mean MIT. Given that university's importance to the study of American history, that is entirely proper. But no one institution can claim a monopoly any more than one school of thought can. And so, as a non-Harvardian, indeed as a native New Yorker, long ensconced in Princeton of all places, it's an additional honor to be speaking with you this evening. To say, we were in the Transcendental Nook, and I was reading a really wonderful book by a Princeton critic and biographer named Carlos Baker, and I was trying to capture the spirit of what I was going to bring to you here as a non-native. And he talked about the reaction that a particular friend of Emerson's named Charles Eliot Norton had to Walt Whitman's writing. And he said what Walt Whitman managed to do was to combine the characteristics of a Concord philosopher and a New York fireman. It is in the spirit of Walt Whitman that I address you this evening, fresh out of the Transcendental Cove. The imposing list of my predecessors prompted other thoughts as well. Going back a generation and more to mentors and friends like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., whom Maya very graciously mentioned, Bernard Bailyn. The names put me in mind of my own, very much unfinished, but now not so short career as a historian. It reminds me of how much the writing of history has changed from when I started out, when the study of politics and ideas still dominated the field, through the ascendancy of social and cultural history, on to today's fixations on, even obsessions with class, race, and gender, especially race and gender, and even more especially race. It reminds me of how these changes involved evolution as much as they did sharp breaks. Of how, for example, a scholar like Bernard Bailyn, who did so much early in his career to expand our understanding of Puritanism, and then, above all, of the American Revolution, went on to write trailblazing studies of migration and demography and cultural exchange in the Atlantic world. And this, of course, put me in mind of where my own writing has come and gone. And I'll be talking a little bit, I will be talking about slavery, as Maya said, but it's going to be kind of after I get through a lot of other stuff. Because it really did, reading those names really did make me think, well, let me look back for the first time in a long time. Where have I been, and what does this all amount to? Well, I suppose that looking back, my approach to history has involved trying to permute and combine older concerns with newer concerns. That is, to write social history in its political context and political history in its social context. It always struck me that politics was empty without an understanding of its social origins and connections, and that likewise the study of social change and the conflicts behind them was incomplete without an understanding of how those conflicts resolve themselves in formal politics. Politics not just as some social scientific abstraction, but as a contest of individuals as well as political parties. And so in my dissertation, my first book, I set out to examine the rise of the working class in early 19th century New York City, the most productive manufacturing center in the nation by 1850, as a political and intellectual, as well as an economic and social history. So in a more focused book, I wrote on a maniacal religious cult, also in New York City. I've been around various places. This maniacal cult, Whigs and Democrats lurked alongside evangelical zealots, sensation-stirring penny press editors, and a town drunk. So in the longest book I've yet written, A History of the Rise of American Democracy, figures like Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, and Abraham Lincoln jostled alongside the Shawnee prophet Tenskwatawa, the Boston abolitionist David Walker, and the upstate New York anti-slavery women's rights champion Elizabeth Cady Stanton, not to mention battalions of even lesser-known protagonists. But whether out of restlessness or attention deficit disorder, maybe, other subjects and other modes of writing beckoned as well. I grew up in the 1950s and 1960s in a family of Greenwich Village booksellers, which had a lasting influence on everything about me. Inside that milieu of non-academic, quasi-academic, and anti-academic intellectuals, poets, painters, journalists, and more, it was as important to write well as it was to write truthfully. Indeed, just as nothing could be written well unless it was true, nothing could be true unless it was written well. Indeed, written beautifully. Inside that structure of aspiration and prestige, it occurred to me that writing a piece of serious history for the Village Voice would be nearly as significant an achievement, maybe even more significant, as writing a piece of serious history for the American Historical Review. And so it has gone. I confess to you tonight, as I don't think I've ever done in public before, I confess to you tonight that although I have sincerely tried, really tried hard, I've never succeeded in publishing a standard peer-reviewed academic publication. And it's not as if I didn't submit these things. I have kept every rejection letter and every review. And sometime I intend to publish them. Anyway, that's true. On the other hand, one of my first publications was an essay on Martin Van Buren, yes, Martin Van Buren, for the Village Voice Literary Supplement. I can say that this path met with universal approval from my academic peers. I certainly wouldn't recommend it to any junior colleague writing today. Nor do I take it as a more worthy path than a more conventional academic career, nor celebrate it with Sinatra-esque defiance as my way. It's just a matter, I suppose, of where one's talents lie. At any rate, it's the way things worked out for better and for worse. It did, though, lead me in one direction that I've never regretted. As I said, my family ran a bookshop in Greenwich Village at a very exciting time in the 1950s and 1960s. One little anecdote from that time is the story of how Bob Dylan met Allen Ginsberg at a party in my uncle's apartment above the shop in 1963. True story. We can talk about it more at the reception afterwards if you'd like. It's an interesting story in many ways. Beyond the characters, it's a ribald story in many ways, as you might expect from at least one of those characters. But from that seed, and from my experience of that time and place, came my decision getting on to 50 years later, to write the book, Bob Dylan in America, which is my effort to place Dylan's art in the larger American contexts of which Dylan is a master. And that decision accompanied an entry into a world of musicians and musicologists and Rolling Stone writers that I'd only brushed up against growing up. So it led me from one place to another place via another place. I've never regretted that. But what about now? Since writing that Dylan book and a follow-up history of Columbia Records, as Maya mentioned, and after an earlier byway excursion to write a political history of what I called the Age of Reagan, I returned to my work on the late 18th century and early 19th century. In one of those serendipitous turns that happen from time to time, my friend Henry Louis Gates invited me to deliver the Nathan Huggins Lectures at, yes, Harvard University. As the Huggins Lectures are devoted to African American history and letters, I pondered what I might cover and decided to take another look at a topic that had been bugging me, a perennial and perennially controversial topic, the place of slavery in the framing and ratification of the US Constitution. A virtually uncontested orthodoxy, then at least, held that the Constitution was a firmly pro-slavery document, and that recalcitrant slaveholders had intimidated the rest of the Constitutional Convention in 1787 into granting compromises over representation, the Atlantic slave trade, and the return of fugitive slaves that enshrined human bondage into national law. Going back to my work on that book, The Rise of American Democracy, I had my doubts about that. Doubts that I'd meant to pursue, but I got distracted. The attention deficit disorder hit again. I just let it slide. I laid it aside. That research had turned up quotations from firmly anti-slavery delegates at the convention in 1787. People forget that there were really very extraordinarily powerful anti-slavery delegates at Philadelphia in 1787, as well as from James Madison, to the effect that property in humans could not be and was not admitted as a legitimate national institution in the new national constitution. I turned up similar comments in that book that on democracy from later anti-slavery agitators who asserted that the framers had purposely excluded slavery from national law, not out of shame, not out of embarrassment, but out of principle. They did it because they thought it was necessary and important, crucial, that that be done. And then there are the affirmations of still later figures no less auspicious than Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, that the Constitution was, in Frederick Douglass's words, quote, a glorious freedom document. How could that be, given the orthodoxy among my fellow historians? Well, sometimes, indeed often, I knew, what historians deem to be incontrovertible has turned out to be dead wrong, or at least deeply flawed. But rarely is the agreement as solid as this one about slavery in the Constitution. Rarely has the agreement enjoyed the backing of other experts, in this case constitutional lawyers, placed as high as the Supreme Court, let alone a certain university's law school. Rarely has the agreement involved a matter of such importance, one that drives straight to the heart of the national experience, and in ways that actually comported with my own sense of historical development as well as of social justice. All of which, of course, made investigating the matter absolutely irresistible. If the agreement held up, the grounds for it would be all the stronger. If it did not, well, then we'd have a problem. The kind of problem that advances debate and enlightenment. So I decided to take a fresh look at the best source on the convention's proceedings. In fact, the only source. You remember the Constitutional Convention in 1787 was held in secret, behind closed doors. They didn't want anybody knowing what was going on inside there. But meanwhile, James Madison, the compulsive graphomaniac that he was taking notes on everything as it went along. He slightly edited them the day after and so forth. They're not perfect, but they're the best source we have of what people are actually saying inside that convention. They were only published after he died in 1836. They were finally published in 1840. At any rate, I decided to go back over those private notes. This is the source that every historian, every constitutional expert uses to talk about what happened in the Constitution. If you're an originalist, which I'm not, this is the Rosetta Stone. These notes. I went back to those notes, and I found there something that no modern historian had quite seen. And that doesn't happen a lot. I mean, I see some, fellow historians in the room. That doesn't happen a lot, especially a source that's been read so many times. It's one thing to find a new source out there and say, this happened, or that didn't happen, or this guy proved. This was something that people had read 1,000,000 times. But part of the problem is that reading 18th century script and prose and the renditions of it's not easy. These things are all online, so I encourage you, go online. James Madison, notes on the convention. Inside of 10 minutes, you're either going to be stumped, bored, or frustrated, right? Because of just the nature of the source itself. So it's not completely surprising that people didn't see what I saw. And on the spur of the moment, a dirty secret. Because they're online, they're also searchable. So I can do things that previous historians couldn't do, which is namely isolate particular words, particular phrases, particular things that would lead me in my research that would have taken other people 1,000,000 years to have to plow through the whole thing. I was able to do it in a different way. So in a way, it's as a pay into technology. But technology is not going to tell you what it means. It's only going to get you there. But it did make the job considerably easier than it would. It certainly saved me a lot of time, that's for sure. At any rate, I did all of that. And what I saw, which I thought others had not seen, was that the majority of the convention, including these anti-slavery people, one of the people who didn't talk about slavery a lot was Benjamin Franklin. Remember, he was at the convention in 1787. In 1787, he was about to be, or he was already named, the president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. There were several other people who had been in the Abolition Society, especially from Pennsylvania. There were a lot, Gouverneur Morris from New York, well, there were a lot of anti-slavery people there. This is often forgotten, but it's true. And they had convinced the majority of the convention that the majority had indeed quite purposefully and over and against the pro-slavery delegates from the lower South. And if you want to see clever politicians, you read how they operated in Philadelphia in 1787. Those guys were not only rebarbative and difficult, but boy, oh boy, were they shrewd. At any rate, over and against all of that, they refused to recognize slavery as a national institution, despite the fact that the pro-slavery people were pushing very hard to have the convention do exactly that. It wasn't that the majority refused to use the word slavery because they were ashamed to do so, or that they thought it might create opposition in the new northern states. Time and again, the pro-slavery delegates had tried to insert not just the word slavery, but with it the fact that slaves existed as property in the various states, but would not be so recognized in the Constitution. And every time the convention majority, led by anti-slavery delegates like Gouverneur Morris, every time this came up, they firmly rejected those efforts. It didn't happen a lot, but it happened enough. As the majority decided slavery would certainly continue to exist, the chances of the Constitutional Convention in 1787 abolishing slavery, I mean, if there's a less than zero, that's what it was. It simply was not going to happen. The Georgians and the South Carolinians, indeed the Virginians too, were not going to go along with any constitution that abolished slavery. So slavery will continue to exist, but only as a creature of state laws. And that is very important. The lawyers in the crowd will understand that right away. In those instances where slavery could not be ignored, above all in the fugitive slave provision, which the Southerners stuck in at the last minute, slaves would be regarded, contrary to the slaveholders' demands, as persons, not as property, which might seem like a difference, a distinction without a difference, but it made all the difference in the world. So long as the Constitution deemed slaves as persons, slavery would receive no automatic validation in areas under federal purview, including the national territories. If they were deemed property, they would be, but they weren't, including the Northwest Territories, or even as the convention was meeting in Philadelphia, the Confederation Congress in New York had banned slavery. It would make the fugitive slave issue a matter of state comity, not federal imperative. Although later on, Southerners would get their way and we get the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and there's a whole different world, but not yet in 1787. It would mean that by taking the first blow ever in the name of a national government against the Atlantic slave trade, which the framers did, the Constitution would not be validating property in man. When I say they did that, the framers gave the federal government, the new federal government, the power to abolish slavery. The Southerners had said, you do that, we're out of here. The Southerners had to eat crow and accept it. They got their compromise. But nothing like this, no such power like this had been granted to a federal government, quite the national government. No declaration of that had been done up to this point. So, given those struggles, and given those outcomes, it made no sense to describe the Constitution, at least as far as I could see, as flatly pro-slavery. It made no more sense to do that than it did to describe the Constitution as flatly anti-slavery. In important ways, it was both. Both. On matters connected to slavery, the Constitution was indeed a series of compromises that left open the issue of slavery's future to be settled by future generations. Framers did this a lot. They're going to kick the can down the road. It's going to be settled however the politics work themselves out. And indeed, as we know in this case, the issue would only be settled finally in blood over precisely the issues of property, territory, and fugitive slaves that had been so prominent at the nation's founding. Just as slavery had been there when the nation began, so the struggle over slavery was there when the nation began. And that's really my point. So, I was was revved up. I mean, can you imagine? It doesn't happen that much, right? Excited at the thought that I had found something that previous historians had missed, and on a hugely important matter, I devoted my Huggins lectures to showing what I had found and elaborating its importance, and then I enlarged those lectures, as one does, into a book. These findings did not go unchallenged. Not at all. Although the thrust of these challenges was a little surprising to me. As I saw it, what I'd found added a new dimension to the history of American radicalism. And there was, there being nothing more radical at the end of the 18th century than anti-slavery. Slavery had been an institution that had been tolerated, thought of as perfectly natural, and certainly by the great European powers that settled the New World, it was uncontested except by a few Quakers outside of Philadelphia. There was more, it was coming, but it was still a very radical stance to take. So I thought that by finding this stuff, I was contributing to the history of American radicalism. Against the received idea of historical pro-slavery consensus, I found that Americans, white Americans, property-holding Americans, slaveholders and non-slaveholders had been in conflict over slavery right from the start, which I thought made our country's history much more interesting than it had been with the old agreement. But I discovered that at least some historians and other commentators weren't so interested, that the idea of a pro-slavery imperative at the nation's founding was too important to abandon. Well, if I can crow a little bit, just a little bit, I'm gratified to say that 4 years on, the evidence of the conclusions that I came up with stand unscathed. Indeed, virtually unchallenged as history. On the strength of that, I've now engaged in writing a full political history entitled The Triumph of American Anti-Slavery, as Maya so nicely mentioned, as a companion volume to the rise of American democracy, covering roughly the same period from the Revolution to the Civil War, but from a completely different angle, from many different angles, completing what I hope will be a comprehensive two-volume study of the two great political and social revolutions that marked the so-called Age of Revolution, the Democratic Revolution, which in no small degree began here, in this town, and the anti-slavery revolution, to which this town contributed greatly. Two revolutions that were entwined, but were not at all identical. People who turn up in my first volume look pretty good. They're not gonna look so good in volume 2. Vice versa. People that look kind of not so great, become heroes in volume 2. And there are lots of other people who are not in volume 1 who are gonna show up in volume 2. Entwined though, obviously, but not identical. So, that is where I am right now. Caroline can attest. Wish me luck. It's a big job. But having given you a brief account of how I got here, permit me to close with some quick remarks about the state of history writing from where I sit now, in particular with respect to the history of slavery and anti-slavery. It should come as no surprise that at a time of intense political polarization, as the United States and the rest of the Western world is passing through right now, views of history should become polarized as well. And with polarization, inevitably comes a flattening of historical perception, an impatience with nuance, a mistrust of complexity, an imputation that alertness to ambiguity or paradox is really an apology for oppression. Indeed, even an apology for evil. It should be no less surprising that when this polarization should accompany, indeed help produce a time of atonement, what some have called a reckoning, on the nation's continued oppressions and inequalities, all of them unquestionably rooted in our past, that again, historical perceptions might suffer. Unfortunately, times of polarization and atonement are not usually propitious times for the study of history. They can unlock a lot, but they can undo a lot as well. They can offer all sorts of new questions, but can also offer very simplistic answers. And so we read today, for example, claims that the United States was founded on the principles of white supremacy, principles that supposedly remain the fundament of American politics and society to this day. For generations, scholars slighted, even ignored, the centrality of slavery to our history. In the 1950s and 1960s, a new generation of historians, including, and I am particularly proud, was particularly proud to see that one of my Miller Award predecessors was John Hope Franklin, who helped undo this. What? He helped explode that willful ignorance. Indeed, that strictly enforced ignorance. If you tried to break with it, you weren't going to be able to be published in the American Historical Review. You might get published in the Village Voice, but that was much earlier, later. But today we read that slavery was the totality of our history, that indeed the United States was in the vanguard of racial bondage, and that efforts to vindicate the principle of equality inscribed in the Declaration of Independence were, like the Declaration itself, fraudulent exercises in bad faith. We forget that anti-slavery politics not only existed on these shores, they originated here. In the crucible of the American Revolution, the first anti-slavery society in the history of the world was founded in Philadelphia either 2 weeks before or 2 weeks after the events here in Concord in April 1775. We forget that second only to the schismatic settlement of Vermont, this very state where we are tonight was the first government in the Atlantic world, indeed in modern history, to abolish slavery outright. Doing so after more than a decade of struggle, it wasn't easy, against very powerful pro-slavery interests. We forget that the American patriots, far from trying to keep open a slave trade that the British had been trying to suppress, they were the ones who were trying to close the trade that the Crown insisted would continue. So we've gone, in all, from a place where slavery and white racism have gone from being nothing in American history, nothing, to being everything in American history, the very essence of American history. Both of those views, I submit, are false. Indeed, they are less historical views than they are temptations. Temptations to righteous simplification. American history written without its history of anti-slavery is just as wrong-headed as American history written without its history of slavery. Unfortunately, though, amid our polarization and atonement, a refusal to subscribe wholeheartedly to one view runs the risk of being labeled an upholder of the opposite view, which in turn intimidates objections and squelches honest debate. I can feel the pull in the room. I don't want to be gloomy here. I do not want to end on a gloomy note. Not at all. The time will come when, for better or worse, the current polarization will end. The time will come when atonement will turn one way or another toward redemption. No falsehood, I believe, can live forever, even though we can be sure that new falsehoods will arise to take their place. But that is all the more reason to rededicate ourselves to a cause that Ruth Ratner Miller devoted herself to, the cause that we memorialize and celebrate this evening, the continued exploration and opening up of the study of American history with no settled conclusions, let alone settled dogmas. If history is to humankind what memory is to the individual, it will always be incomplete, subject to lapses and repressions and convenient amnesia, subject to false pride, subject to all the deeper configurations that lie beyond our comprehension. But like individual memory, history can be questioned, probed, reasoned over, with a record that, though itself incomplete, contains enough solid hints and provokers to bring us closer to the truth. It was Voltaire, I think, who dismissed history as a bag of tricks we play upon the dead. I get the point. Still, there is an art and mystery to the historian's vocation that allows us to counter each other's tricks and banish what yet another Harvard historian, W.E.B. Du Bois, called the propaganda of history. It can feel often like an impossible task. Sometimes it can feel like an impossible task, but that's no reason for despair. Because even on the most parlous days, the rewards can be great. And if nothing else, the work is steady. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here in this beautiful New England autumn with my beautiful wife that I just ran right over to sit next to her again and just be part of the whole thing. But then I am very grateful for your reception. So.
Are we going to do some questions? Do you have questions?
Questions. Right. Absolutely.
We have
Oh, sure. Take.
Good, thank you, sir.
Not at all.
All right.
Yes, sir.
I'm not sure I'm 100% correct on this, but I think the British offered emancipation to any African American who fought against the Southern colonials. Could that have possibly been an early emancipation if we lost a revolution?
Ah, yes. That's the Dunmore Proclamation in Virginia. After the revolutionaries had more or less overtaken Virginia as an act of desperation, Lord Dunmore offered emancipation only to the slaves of patriots, not to the slaves of loyalists. He was trying to undo, the rebellion. And that was an act of, he says, I'm left with nothing left. So to think of it as a kind of prologue to the Emancipation Proclamation is just wrong. It was a military act. It was a calculated military act that was attempting to do that. It's quite true that during the Revolution, enslaved people, if there's one thing on it, it's freedom. And they see white people shooting at each other, and they're going to take the best opportunity to gain their own freedom, and they do that all the time. So many thousands of enslaved African Americans run to the British lines. Some places, Rhode Island's one of them, actually do offer freedom to enslaved blacks who fight on the Patriot side. More slaves fought for the British than fought for the American Patriot side, but some fought on both sides. So in a case of war, in an enslaved society, it undoes everything. It undoes the very it challenges the very institution. And slaves are going to be part of that whole mix. But to see the British as somehow great emancipators, I think is just wrong-headed, actually. It's misreading what the situation was. It's quite true that Abraham Lincoln didn't do the Emancipation Proclamation in the Civil War, but it was a very different war than the war of the American Revolution. Now, because it was a war, they say it was explicitly over slavery, which the American Revolution was not. Now, there's much else to talk about in all of this, which is really quite fascinating. But, I mean, I love the British. The British are friends of mine. The great, the special relationship. I went to school there for all of that. Most of the African Americans who ran to British lines, not the ones who were emancipated, but most who ended up being re-enslaved and sent to Jamaica. People don't know that. Some were sent to Sierra Leone. Many were freed in New York City in particular, not Sierra Leone, sorry, to Nova Scotia, right? Where they lived a very, very difficult life and ended up having to move to Sierra Leone, well, many of them did. So to see and by the way, Lord Dunmore, the guy I just mentioned, big slaveholder, ended up as the Governor General of Jamaica. So to see the situation in that, this is what I mean by simplification, you see. I mean, yes, something happened, and plenty of African-American former slaves ended up in Nova Scotia really happy to be out of where they were. So I'm not in any way trying to deny that. That's important, an important part of it. But to avoid those situations of the complexity that were there, I think lends us to that simplification, which I think is misleading. Yes, Robert.
That was great, and I have a sort of suggestion question for you.
Yes.
I wonder if the decision by the Constitutional Congress not to positively recognize slavery was the American equivalent of the Somerset decision.
Okay, excellent question. This is Professor Gross, who's a great historian in his own right. So this is shop talk in a way, and I'm delighted to do it. I mean, of your town, this is the historian, and of much else as well, but of your town especially. The Somerset decision in 1772 was a decision that was taken to mean that slavery was abolished in the British Isles, or could not exist in the British Isles, and that any slave who set foot in the British Isles was automatically free. That's the way that the decision was interpreted. I mean, I don't know the exact number, maybe you do, but it was, maybe 10,000, 15,000 enslaved persons in the British Isles in comparison to the hundreds of thousands of enslaved people in Jamaica and in Barbados, which was, the worst of them all. So the decision did a lot to say something about the state of slavery in the British Isles, but it did not touch what was going on in the heartland of British slavery, which was the Caribbean. The thing about what the Constitution did, it wasn't exactly analogous, but there was one way in which it was. And that was on the question of fugitive slaves. I really don't want to give you a whole lecture, but maybe you deserve a nice, right? This is that kind of occasion. Okay, so. Back up. In 1776, there was slavery in every state. Every state had slavery. But that began to change in the course of the Revolution. Pennsylvania passed the first gradual Emancipation Act in modern history in 1780. In 1784, Connecticut and Rhode Island passed gradual Emancipation Acts, which were not so gradual in terms of the children. It gave immediate freedom to the children of mothers of slaves, of enslaved mothers. Okay. This was extraordinary. People think this is nothing much. It was really extraordinary, the first emancipation. That was very worrisome to slaveholders in neighboring states, like Maryland. Because if they saw the possibility of freedom in Pennsylvania, what were they going to do with their own slaves? So the slaveholders were very insistent there be some kind of thing put in the Constitution about return of fugitive slaves. Okay? And very late, so the Constitutional Convention's in Philadelphia over the spring and summer of 1787. These places were hot. They stank. It was awful and awful. It was just very unpleasant. And here were these guys were in a room that was sealed off, very hot. They all wanted to go home by the time they got to August. They just wanted to get out of there. And they had settled all the main issues that I was talking about, although they hadn't figured out the Electoral College yet, and maybe they should have stayed longer when it came to the Electoral College. But that's another issue. On this matter, though, up jumps a South Carolinian named Rutledge who says, we want to make sure that our fugitive slaves get, don't. And they say, and we're going to call them slaves, and we're going to make you return them as property. Reading Addison's notes, they're not terribly eloquent in many ways. They're rather cryptic. But you can almost hear the sigh over, what are we going to do about this? Well, they realized pretty quickly that they have a dilemma because there are these free states that hadn't existed before. And they had to do something about this. They had to reassure the South that they weren't going to become havens in the way that Britain could have become. And this is where the similarity to the Somerset rule is involved. What are we going to do about this? Now, if you're an enslaved person in South Carolina, it's going to be very hard for you to get to Britain, right? But it's not necessarily going to be so hard for you to get to Pennsylvania. And especially if you're in Maryland, it's really not hard to get to Pennsylvania. So even on 95 today, it's not that hard to get to Pennsylvania. But so they feel like they have to do something. But the Southerners are pushing, as I said, to have the words slavery in there, to have them considered as property. And here's where the similarity, what they were doing was not unlike, because they wanted to prevent these, the fugitive slaves from being considered as property. And if you read through the Madison's notes, you see that they go back and forth about this, and they are absolutely insistent. Yes, they called them persons held to service or labor. Persons held to service or labor in 1787 could mean an apprentice. It could mean any number of bound laborers, not black, not enslaved, not chattel slavery, but persons held, that's what it meant. So it should really be called the Fugitive Persons Held to Bound Labor Law, provision. Everybody knew it was about slavery. But the wording was such as to make it impossible for the federal government to be pulled into enforcing that law. Now, subsequently, the Southerners are great politicians. They passed the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793, and they passed the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which is really draconian, and that's a big deal in Concord, right? Because that law really does, in many ways, it just inflames the political situation. It's really the kickoff to what's to come. So, in effect, the Southerners were able to make that, on the basis of that clause, making it into something that the framers did not have in mind. But that wasn't what was going on in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia in 1787. It's a very long-winded answer, Bob, to your excellent question, that there were, but people had Somerset on their minds, and the Southerners really had Somerset on their minds. It's interesting, the West Indians slaveholders were not so concerned about, well, no, they were more concerned about it. Americans, not so much. But as the Northerners begin to pass these emancipation laws, as the abolitionist movement actually gets going in the years after 1772, Southerners look to Somerset and say, maybe something's going to happen. They're going to do to us what Lord Mansfield, the British judge, did in Somerset. So we're very, very wary. And when you read these Southerners, they're really touchy on this. And they're going to remain that way all the way to 1860-61 when they finally split, when they finally just say, we're out of here. But the touchiness of the Southern slaveholders on these issues is one reason why they try to get these things through in 1787. That's connected to Somerset. And it remains a legacy right through to the Civil War. Southerners, well, how political do I want to? I'm not going to get too political. I'll stay inside of history. But the history of state rights in America is in no small degree connected to this history. Because the entire idea is Southerners, or Southern white slaveholders, were particularly nervous about giving too much power to the federal government because they might use that power to get rid of slavery. And that was something that John Quincy Adams was hip to. John Quincy Adams and hip are not necessarily the two words that go together in my mind, 3 or 4 words that go together, but actually I'm a great admirer of his, so I'm going to do it. He's very well aware of all this, and he pushes it very, very hard in the 1830s and 1840s. But that touchiness is at the root of what state rights is all about. The idea is, if you have a nation, then local inequalities and oppressions will be undone. That's been the history of the United States in many ways. This is why the federal government, look up there, right? That was in a clarion call to federal action to end a local voting rights and other oppressions that have lasted since the 1890s. But it's always the federal government that's going to do that because people from outside of that locality are going to have power over you. That's dangerous to these people. So in that sense, Somerset is coming up for a decision in the midterm elections in 2022. So it's really important. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Melissa. I classed in your class 25 years ago.
Oh, Alyssa.
Really nice to hear you.
You haven't
tonight.
changed a bit.
Thank you. I'm sure you remember me well.
But I have, unfortunately. And I got the pictures to prove it. But go ahead.
I'm a history teacher now, and so and I've assigned your work before, and I've been struck watching the development of your career, how your own paradigms have shifted, certainly on the basis of new evidence, but also incorporating new lenses. And I guess I'm mostly curious as a scholar, what has been most influential to you as you address some of the same topics over the course of your career in causing your framing to shift?
That's a good question. Because that's the question I actually avoided in my talk. I'm going to try to avoid it now. I mean, I'd like to be able to say, you know, I'm pure empiricism. I just saw this new data and it just changed my mind. I think what year did you take my course?
97.
Okay. Well, that was really when that's exactly when I was making the turn. So you saw, I didn't let you guys know because I was your teacher, but my mind was kind of and that, well, there have been several, but that was an important one. And all right, I'll tell another secret. That long book that I wrote, I'd started that book around 1985. And by the time you came into my class, I still hadn't finished it. I had a long draft and I hadn't finished it. In 1998, I had a fellowship at a place called the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. It's actually in the Ronald Reagan building. Or at least it was then. They keep changing names, but they haven't changed that one. And I was present during, it was the winter of the Clinton impeachment. And for a whole bunch of reasons, I got involved in all of that, for perfectly sound intellectual, constitutional reasons. But I witnessed how politics operated in a way that I hadn't before. I saw how I had a front row seat on a constitutional and political crisis, which for an historian is an extraordinary thing, what it was for me anyway. So I ended up after that year having to rip up an entire manuscript that I'd written, hundreds of pages. I didn't rip it up exactly, but I wasn't going to be able to publish it because I learned something about how politics is actually conducted at the center of power that I just had no idea about before. Before, it was all stick figures in comparison to what it was going to be. It was going to be much more about, you know, politics was going to become much more personal than it was. It was strategy involved, all the rest of it, big social issues, all of that. But I wasn't going to be able to write it correctly unless I took that seriously. So that was the biggest shift, I think. And that was purely out of, you know, that was purely by accident, really. But yeah, I mean, just right then, I was making a decision to write much more about politics and taking politics seriously, not as a kind of epiphenomenon to all the social stuff that I probably taught you, but as actually, you know, at the center of the story in a way that hadn't been before. So that was important, yeah.
Do my real job. I'm Ann Ursa Leggett of the Friends of the Library, and that speech and this evening has really done exactly the justice to Ruth Ratner Miller's goals for understanding and appreciating the civic responsibility of knowing our history. So thank you very much. I want to tell you a little bit about this award. When our library was built in 1873, there was an iron fence around the sort of Victorian part out front. And when that was taken down, the finials off the fence were saved in our special collections to give to honored guests and special occasions. So thank you very much.
Wow.
May I present?
Wow, thank you. That's
welcome. Well, thank you. And so I am presenting to you the Ruth Ratner Miller 2022 award to Sean Wilentz on behalf of the Friends of the Library. So thank you all. Please come next door and get books signed and talk more to Sean and have some treats.
I'm gobsmacked, flabbergasted. This is the most beautiful thing. This is the most beautiful thing. I know exactly where it's going to go. Unless you want to change that. No, this is really extraordinary. So thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great.